Hello, this is section 2, lecture 1, and in this section we're going to be looking at a brief history of U.S. foreign policy. This overlaps or corresponds with chapter 2 of your textbook, and I have here a quote from Shakespeare. What is past is prologue. Now, perhaps he didn't mean this in a precise sense, but if we look at U.S. foreign policy history, we see that it builds on itself. And everything that has happened in the past puts us at the present time and informs the present time and how foreign policy is developed. And we'll see that particularly with foreign policy doctrines that we'll talk about in the second lecture. Why does history matter? Well, as I just said, everything sort of builds on itself when it comes to foreign policy. Different presidents speak to one another's policies, either support them or change them. And we see then that this goes all the way back to the beginning of our nation state. The ideas and the experiences of the framers of the Constitution have and still do shape our views of foreign policy, how we should act. Past interactions with other countries show the way of acting with them today. U.S. power historically has changed over time, increasing to what we referred to in the first lecture as hegemony. And international relations of countries and organizations also have changed then over time. Their power has changed. Their policy priorities have changed, and this affects our foreign policy and how we react to them. If we look at U.S. foreign policy history, we can see two major influences or themes. One is isolationism and the other is internationalism. And these form a tug of war at some points for priority in our foreign policy. Isolationism is maintaining a detachment from the rest of the world, focusing on our domestic issues, our economy, our problems. We will see this at the beginning of our nation state, focusing on expansion to the west, for example. But also we'll see that isolationism comes in a reaction to international events like wars. Oftentimes after wars, the United States has engaged in an isolationist period in reaction to having been involved in international wars. But what we'll see is a main theme, and of course, because this class is U.S. foreign policy, what we'll see as a main theme is internationalism. This is expanding our presence in the world, expanding our power in the world, expanding our connection with other nation states in the world as we see the U.S. promote our foreign policy interests. So if we go all the way back, and we said that the ideas of the framers, the ideas of the founders of the Constitution influence our foreign policy, none is more pointed to than George Washington's farewell speech when he's leaving the office of the presidency. And he covers several issues in that speech, but he also refers to elements of foreign policy and promotes the idea of the United States being neutral and staying out of the political affairs of others, staying out of the wars of others particularly. So I have a few quotes here. It's our true policy to steer clear of the permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Now, in this speech, he does not use the term entangling alliances. He oftentimes gets credit for that, but it's Thomas Jefferson who actually uses that phraseology. Another quote here is, the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is extending our commercial relations, but having as little to do politically with them as possible. Well, there we have the United States promoting its true interests abroad, but staying out of the politics, staying out of the wars of other nation states. And then finally, he says the duty of holding a neutral conduct may be inferred without anything more from the obligation which justice and humanity impose on every nation. Several instances in this speech he references fair treatment and equal treatment, or equal regard, I guess I should say, toward all nations, and not favoring one over the other. And so this sets up in many people's minds a sense of isolationism from the beginning, that the United States, separate geographically from other major powers in the world, European powers particularly, should be separate politically from them too. And oftentimes, Washington's farewell speech gets pointed to, even in the present, when regarding our foreign policy actions. And so, here I have a few examples of isolationism historically. If we look at the mid 1800s, the United States had more of an inward focus rather than an outward focus. Westward expansion is part of this. Of course, there was a inward focus in the Civil War and Reconstruction periods as well. There tended to be an isolationist sense in the United States after World War I and what were referred to as the interwar periods. Not just because of the aftermath of World War I and its destructiveness, but also because of the Great Depression and the U.S. focusing on domestic priorities rather than international ones. Examples of this include the U.S. not joining the League of Nations, Congress renouncing war as an instrument of national policy along with 15 other countries, Congress passing the Neutrality Acts during the Great Depression era, keeping us out of the pending war, the coming war in Europe that we call World War II. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a period of isolationism, particularly in the 1970s, due to the aftermath of the Vietnam War. This is referred to as the Vietnam Syndrome. The public believed that the U.S. shouldn't intervene militarily unless we were absolutely threatened. And this was based on a sense of doubt in the United States that we were truly superior, that we were truly morally superior in the wake of our behavior and actions in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam era. But most of our history can be defined as internationalist or expansionist. So if we go back to the early 1800s, there's no better example of this than Manifest Destiny, an idea linked to American exceptionalism, that it was our duty from God, our ability from God to expand all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And early expansionism includes the Louisiana Purchase, the 1812 war with the UK. We know it as an Eastern War, but in part of the aftermath of that, we gained what was then called the Oregon Territory, Northern California, Oregon, Idaho, Washington State, those areas. Another big example of internationalism during this time is the Monroe Doctrine. And this sets up for a long time, and even today, our relationship with Latin American states. President James Monroe declared colonization in the Western Hemisphere by European nation states to be a threat to U.S. national security. And so we see, as part of our foreign policy history, a focus towards Latin American influence. In the mid 1800s, we see then, as part of our manifest destiny and westward expansion, internationalist sense in being involved in wars with Mexico. We annexed Texas in 1845, and then in 1848, the Southwest was gained by the United States in a treaty with Mexico after the U.S. Mexican War. And so here we see a visual representation of that. You see Manifest Destiny there on the left, at different time periods gaining territory, going all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And if you have really good eyesight, you can see then Seward's Folly there and gaining Alaska, and then being involved in other areas. On the right, you see a visual representation of the Monroe Doctrine. There we see Uncle Sam, without a top hat this time, but in a little Civil War era kepi, keeping European powers out of Latin America. So, what's the justification for this expansion? What's the justification for this political influence in Latin America, particularly? Well, the political rationale is to keep European powers from having influence in the Americas and thus having influence over the United States. And so the Monroe Doctrine detached the United States from Europe, but strengthened our regional power in the Western Hemisphere. Morally, or from sort of a moralistic stance at least, Manifest Destiny was an extension of the ideology of American exceptionalism. And so there was this cultural and religious justification for westward territorial expansion. But ultimately, we'll see then a true driver of all our international expansion in economic rationales, opening new markets in Latin America, in Asia particularly, which helps U.S. businesses and commercial sectors with trade and gaining wealth. This is still the largest basis of our involvement internationally, the economic rationale. If we look at further expansionist periods in the late 1800s, we see expansion beyond just the Pacific U.S. territory to expansion towards Asia. And this is oftentimes referred to as gunboat diplomacy because during the Fillmore administration, in order to open up trade to Japan and China and others, the president sent naval vessels to Tokyo Bay after failed negotiations to establish commercial relations. And so gunboat diplomacy is using military might or military force as a means of political intimidation in order to achieve a nation state's foreign policy. In this case, our foreign policy was commercial expansion. We also see Pacific expansionism in the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands and of Seward's Folly, the annexation or purchasing of Alaska from Russia in 1867. We also see it with the Spanish-American War in the late 1800s. We typically think of involvement in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, but we also have to remember that this includes the Philippines. And President McKinley focused on the Philippines, breaking a general rule for the United States against colonization. And so the Philippines was annexed or colonized for a period of time. This includes Samoa, the Marshall Islands, all these places in the Pacific that the U.S. has naval and commercial ties. And all of this led up to, or also has to do with, economic openness to China as well during the 1800s. And this was seen as a political and economic preventative measure. U.S. foreign policymakers didn't want to see European powers have economic dominance in China or carve up China in a colonial sense. They too wanted economic influence in China. And so we, as part of our foreign policy, had an open door to China economically that we put forward towards other nation states. And so here is a visual representation of gunboat diplomacy. On the left, you see a Japanese rendering, the large American naval vessel and sort of the traditional Japanese vessels. And on the right, you see gunboat diplomacy in Latin America. There, Theodore Roosevelt is enforcing the Monroe Doctrine and fighting against Spain over there. You see Santo Domingo, other Latin American states. And we see that President Roosevelt was very influential in expansionism and internationalism during his tenure, and particularly in Central and South America. And the important policy to come out of this was the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, an expansion of the Monroe Doctrine, stating that the United States has authority of international policing power. Well, this translates to using our military might, or at least military intimidation, if we talk about gunboat diplomacy, in Latin American states. As part of this, there were invasions of different areas. In Panama, for example, we didn't invade, but in order to have access to the Panama Canal, during the Roosevelt administration, there was the support of a coup in Panama. Panama was controlled by Colombia, or part of Colombia at that time, and there was sort of this bloodless revolution aided and abetted by the Roosevelt administration in order to make Panama independent, and thus the United States had greater access to the Panama Canal area. President Taft, for his part, rolled back the militarism of Roosevelt's foreign policy, but focused on what was referred to as dollar diplomacy, influence in Latin America and China based on trade and the strength of the U.S. dollar rather than the strength of the U.S. Military forces. And here we have a visual representation of Teddy Roosevelt riding into Central America, South America, and on the right we see his famous foreign policy statement of walking softly but carrying a big stick when it came to foreign policy, referring to the ideas of military intimidation and shows of force in order to get what you want. Internationalism can also be seen in the World War I era and the U.S. involvement there. President Wilson initially wanted to be neutral, but due to the sinking of the Lusitania, the U.S. was brought into World War I, at first providing munitions and supplies, but then, of course, providing troops. And World War I was intended to be the war to end all wars. And President Wilson led the effort to build the League of Nations, another internationalist stance by the United States. This was a collective security organization. Nation states would ally with one another in order to keep wars of this scale from happening again. But President Wilson's 14 points and the United States ascension into the League of Nations was rejected by Congress. And so the Congress refused to ratify the League of Nations treaty. The League of Nations ultimately fails, and this failure to prevent war leads directly into the buildup before World War II. In the Pacific, Japan invades China and other areas of Asia and Pacific Islands. Italy invades Ethiopia, and the League of Nations really did nothing, had no force to back it up. And then the outbreak of war in World War II. The United States, of course, have this great involvement there on two fronts in the Pacific after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and in the European theater fighting with the so-called Allies. So this leaves us with the aftermath. In the wake of World War II, we really only see the United States in an internationalist or expansionist mode. And this is because World War II set up two hegemons, as it were, a bipolar balance of power. The two poles of power were the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. In the next lecture, we're going to see then specific presidential policies on foreign policy regarding this Cold War era, beginning with President Truman and taking it through President Obama and different presidential doctrines of foreign policy.